All right, thank you everyone for joining us. You are here to see Introduction to Graduate Research Papers. My name is Dr. Marcus Weakley. I am the Director of the Center for Writing and Rhetoric at Claremont Graduate University, and I have here with me a wonderful consultant from the center. Arline, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Arline Votruba. I am a future PhD in cultural studies, and I work as the program coordinator here at the Writing Center, as well as a consultant.
Awesome. So thank you, Arline. Jumping into the content for today, our plans really, we're going to try to cover 4 things. First will be, graduate writing. So some of the expectations of graduate writing that probably differ from undergraduate writing, your experience with undergraduate writing. Then we'll talk a bit about the rhetorical situation, which is a helpful way, I think, to think about a lot of the dynamics and elements that go into really any writing or presenting context, situation thing you have to do. After that, we'll move to humanities research papers. So we'll look specifically at some approaches and strategies for working on humanities graduate level research papers, specifically really keeping in mind or targeting at this point the seminar paper more than anything else. And then do a similar thing with science and social science research papers. So this will focus on, the common genre across sciences and social sciences, and then really some approaches and strategies for working on those. So let's get started. If you don't mind answering this question in chat, I know that a number of you are probably, a prospective student or an incoming student. You're looking forward to your first fall here, your first semester of graduate school, or maybe, you've gotten a master's and you're getting a PhD now, or maybe, you've taken a break from school and you're coming back after a while. In any of these sorts of circumstances, what are you most concerned about with writing in graduate school, or in one of these other cases, maybe the next level, PhD, or returning from a long time off, or maybe a new discipline, right? You have a master's in one field and you're getting another. So what are you most concerned about? Time management and planning, great. How to write academically enough, being concerned about concentration and burnout, planning a writing paper, or planning how to plan writing a paper, breaking it into manageable chunks, having enough depth of ideas, publishable quality, returning after 5 years, being concise, quality, vocabulary usage, great. So what should documents look like? How should they be organized? How long should reading or writing take me? I'm afraid I won't look like I know what I'm doing. How can I improve my writing? What should I ask my professor? What shouldn't I? Maybe you heard a bit of your answer in one of these. These are probably a bit more general than a lot of what you said, but everything that I saw in the chat and everything listed here is totally normal. I like to remind folks that you don't go to graduate school to not learn anything, right? You don't go to graduate school to not be challenged. You don't take this next step for an easy road, right? So along with that decision, that type of life decision, you should be feeling challenged, maybe uncertain about certain things. There's a common phenomenon, psychological phenomenon called imposter syndrome that's discussed a lot around graduate work, and the transition from feeling like a student to becoming a scholar, which is the end goal of a lot of graduate degrees, or from a student to maybe a professional, depending. And in some cases, if you're in the arts, an artist. But so in all of these cases, there is some sort of transformation that goes on in some respect. And a lot of this just has to do with learning, with practice, with application, with these sorts of things that when you're starting out, given that writing is one of the primary modes of expression through which you will be assessed on if you have achieved the expectations, right, of your faculty members, of your field, of these sorts of things, you should be feeling the way that you're mentioning. And I like the insight of what, maybe you yourself have mentioned. You know yourself well enough, something about yourself that maybe you're leaning towards, I'm not sure about kind of the process side of things. I'm concerned about the planning and the time management of being burnt out given everything else that's going on in my life. And maybe some others on the content side where it's like, I don't really know about what a good structure looks like for this type of writing. I don't know, really if I can match that quality. Those sorts of doubts. I think all of these are absolutely normal. Okay.
I'd also add that by joining us today, you're already demonstrating your commitment to find ways to move through graduate writing, and making yourself familiar with the Writing Center is great because there's so many resources and ways to get involved at the Writing Center that have supported me through coursework and now my qualifying exam process. So I just want to encourage you to continue to look at what we have available outside the webinars, because those are the places where I feel like I personally have developed as a writer.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a lot of what I was just talking about is really a major element of the mission behind the Center for Writing and Rhetoric, right? I mean, to be a hub of sorts on campus, to work with students from any discipline at any stage, wherever they're at, through whatever they're working on. So thanks. Differences in writing level. I like to mention this just to maybe provide a little bit of context. So when you're given an assignment in an undergraduate course, and let's not really think about what you might have done in undergrad as kind of a final project if you had one, but let's say you're given an assignment in a course, that's going to be the most common thing that occurs, I think, that we'll ask you to write. And the revolving around those assignments, typically the assessment is there to measure specific skills, right? And that happens in graduate school too. And for the first few years, there's a lot of revolving around assignments, or first year, depending on your program. The key here is that those assignments and those skills that are being assessed, that are being measured, really ask you to engage in a limited way with previous scholarship. A lot of the time, it's going to be the sources that are provided by the faculty member for that course, and maybe a little bit outside of that. Your audience will be the professor. Sometimes your classmates, 9 times out of 10, the professor will be your main and major audience for your final assignment. And this is really student focused, and that's seen in that assessment there, that measurement of the specific skills. On the graduate level, some of the differences, and this happens to greater or lesser degrees depending on the course and the stage of your degree progress. Assignments and tasks will be there to help you, I guess, or to push you to develop a mastery of discipline-specific content as well as conventions, right? And in order to do that, you're going to be asked to engage with previous literature in a way that you weren't asked to do at the undergraduate level, and with more depth and more breadth. And then at a certain point, you will be asked to shift your audience from just being your classmates and professors to writing for the field as a whole. What's often called entering the academic or the scholarly conversation, right? By engaging more deeply and broadly with previous literature, by, in many respects, taking on a graduate degree, showing your intention to contribute to that conversation in one way or another, depending on the degree, you will be asked to show that you are a part of that community. And doing that will be to write about certain topics in certain ways, through disciplinary conventions and through engaging with the previous conversations and debates in the field. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Arline?
Yeah, I just think about the primary difference I see between undergraduate and graduate writing, and like the way I think about it is that undergraduate writing is meant to have the students prove something, like prove that they have the specific skills, prove that they can follow the conventions of the assignment sheet. Whereas graduate writing is to improve something. It's more focused on finding a research question that is novel or unexplored so that you can be adding to the conversation and doing something new to improve the work in the field.
Yep. Completely agree. All right, so to try to help think about any assignment or any assignment you're given, any task, and this works for, again, for spoken as well as written assignments, and from everything from a dissertation to a one-page synopsis, and everything in between. There's a theory developed that's been called the rhetorical situation, which attempts to kind of highlight and define key elements that are helpful to think about in any of these contexts, to both develop, right? So in the process of generating your work, and then of revising it, I think, and really improving it and refining it. So here's a visual that attempts to show kind of, visually, we've got some overlap here, in an attempt to kind of, and I'll do my best to explain it through this image, but more or less the rhetorical situation. You'll see in the back there, the light green, kind of framing the writer, the subject, and the audience, and the subject being, in this case, the topic that's being written about, or of course, just assume spoken about as well, presented on, is the context. Okay, so this is really important. And the context is going to be who is discussing this, where and when is this an issue on a certain level. And then on another level, the context is also something as straightforward as like when it's due. If this is a really piece of high stakes or low stakes writing, if this is the first seminar paper you're being asked to write. So let's say you're in the social sciences and you're just being asked to develop maybe a research question to finish a course, or you're just being asked to develop a literature review as a final assignment, or if you're being asked to develop an entire research project and write about the whole thing. That might be the difference between the context of a final paper in your first year compared to your third year of coursework. Same thing in the humanities. And then you might, there might just be a one-page summary again. I kind of like that because that's like a low stakes piece of writing in many respects for graduate school, to a dissertation, the highest stakes. Those sorts of things define the context. And so what we were talking about before in terms of, is your primary reader or imagined reader your professor, or is it the field? You'll see that that's translated to audience, right? So that's the audience. The writer is you, or maybe a group. Again, depending on your discipline, there's a lot of group writing in certain fields. And then the subject, like I said, is the topic, which has been written about very much, most likely. I mean, it's 2021. So the vast majority of topics have been written about a lot. And so that brings in, through the audience there, as well, and that overlap, a lot of the previous scholarship on the topic. it's important to think about then as well purpose. And purpose is split up here through in two different senses. Exigence, excuse me, and purpose, right? So these are two kind of like layers of why the writer is writing about this subject. And then they've talked about purpose here as what the writer is seeking from this audience. So that's a bit of a nuanced split. The most important thing to take away is that you're writing something, or something is being written for a reason, right? And oftentimes you can appeal to a rhetorical idea of, I want to try to convince my audience of something. I want them to leave having read this piece, either with a certain view or being convinced that like doing this research was worthwhile for reasons X, Y, and Z, that sort of thing. And then you can appeal on a different level of, this subject matter is important just in and of itself, right? In a de facto kind of sense. And there's a reason to write about it, to do research on it, that has a different type of significance. You can think of these as theoretical or practical. There's overlap between those two as well. What's important here, I think, is that text in the middle and right below it, the genre, that piece there, the genre, is what really becomes heightened and super important in graduate school. The conventions of each field at this point have in many respects become highly conventionalized, right? So because of that, your audience will have a clear set of expectations. They're expecting you to make certain moves at certain points. They're expecting you to use a certain type of vocabulary a lot of the time. They're expecting you to use a certain type of evidence, to refer to previous literature in a certain way, all of these things. And when you're first entering graduate school, it might seem opaque, right? You'll be able to read journal articles and you'll be learning so much content from those journal articles that it's often difficult to pay attention to the moves that are being made, to look at it from the perspective of a writer. Because you can read something as a learner, right, as a student, and you're reading that text just to understand, to assimilate, to comprehend new knowledge, right? And then you can read that same text from the perspective of a writer, asking, what moves is this writer making when? What are they doing in the introduction? Not in terms of the ideas they're expressing, but how they're expressing them. How about the next section, the section after that? And it's not really mentioned outside of, the work. I think, it's rarely mentioned probably in courses to consider these two different perspectives outside of the work that we do at the center, I think, because you can learn a lot from approaching text in those two different ways, especially your favorite writing in your field. And that's something that I would recommend that you do. If something really moves you, or you feel like something's really well expressed, take that text as a good example of looking at from both perspectives. But, you want to try to do this as much as you can, as early as you can, to start to think about what, even if you don't go into detail about all these different points of the rhetorical situation, to think about at least those two perspectives and ask yourself, what can I replicate, right? What can I keep from not only the content that I'm learning, but from the researchers, because not all academic writers are good writers, right? So you want to take those good examples and kind of hold on to them and have them be something that you can use to as examples for yourself to improve your own writing, to refer to when you're feeling stuck. What does the good methods section look like? I had a student in a course that took this idea and started to keep, and then now I recommend it whenever I can. He started to keep a folder just for well-written articles. So it didn't really matter what the content was. He was in education, wrote qualitative papers for the most part, right? So he was able to split it up along the structure that I'll talk about a little later. You can do a similar thing, I think, for your field, but he would be like, wow, that's like a really well-written methods section. And he would highlight it, drop it into the subfolder within this folder that he kept of just method sections, right? Like well-written method sections. And then when he would struggle to, if he was having a difficulty, I mean, methods comes to mind because it's like very direct section and it's super precise language, and it's got its own little subgenre thing going there that can be really challenging. He would go and he would just read over these method sections, right? To kind of help him get back to that tone, right? See a great example of that convention. So consider it. You're starting out. It might be good to, start to develop your own kind of resource in this way. But moving on from the rhetorical situation, let's jump to now humanities research papers specifically.
Awesome, thank you. And that was really well said in terms of the rhetorical situation. And one additional comment to keep in mind that I find myself bringing up a lot in writing consultations is that when thinking of your audience, just keep in mind that your reader is not a mind reader. And so one of the most common issues I see happening is people are doing so much research and so embedded in their research, their work, that they forget that not everyone is going to have the same exact background of knowledge. So for some instances, it's important to make sure that you're giving the information necessary to follow your argument. So that's just something to keep in mind when thinking of your audience. Don't always assume the expert, but also assume maybe like one step broader of an audience than that, where it's someone who's interested in your field, but may not have done all the reading. In terms of humanities research papers, I have shared here the structure, which is pretty typical of most humanities research papers. I say pretty typical of most humanities research papers because as a cultural studies scholar, I prefer to think of conventions as guidelines and recognize that there's no hard and true rules to say that you can't try to do something to explore difference in genre. I'm currently reading for quals, and the array of cultural studies texts shows me that not every single one fits into this exact format. However, when getting started, it can be really useful to follow these conventions so that you're making sure you include all of the components that need to fit into a paper. So an introduction, making sure that you're laying things out clearly, demonstrating the research space you're entering, the conversation that you are a part of. And really one of the most important things in any introduction is to help your reader to feel engaged with your project in a way that they see the value and they want to know, where it's going to go because it has something about it that's relevant, engaging, interesting, that makes it worthwhile. The lit review or historiography are the pieces where you demonstrate your familiarity with the field and what people have said about your topic. And it's really setting the groundwork. I always think of this as kind of consolidating the work on your topic in a way that makes it so that your reader doesn't have to go out and do all of that work. You're doing the legwork of finding all the pieces on your particular issue and research question to help demonstrate what's been said about it in order to structure why your particular research question is an extension of the work that's already been done. The body paragraphs then go on to develop this argument with claims and evidence and support. Using primary source evidence in the humanities is really great. So I'm sure that whether you're in the English department, history, or cultural studies, or any of the other departments, you will probably be taking research tools where you learn different strategies, whether it's archival research, ethnography, or different methods for gathering the evidence for your body paragraphs. And then the conclusion is typically just summarizing what you've said and maybe pushing it one step further with new directions that you would hope to go with a following project, questions that are left unanswered, or reflections on what could have been done differently in your study, that type of thing. One thing I'll say in terms of the structure is that although it seems to be logical to begin with an introduction, oftentimes we don't have the information to include in an introduction until we've written the lit review or the body paragraphs or maybe even the conclusion. So don't feel constricted to only starting your paper at the top and writing right through it. You may find out that not until you have your conclusion are you ready to write your introduction, and that's perfectly fine. And then the last thing I'll say about structure is citations. Every grad student's favorite part of the writing process, where you will make sure that anyone you've referenced, any work you've referenced, is clearly cited using either MLA or Chicago, typically in the humanities, which we will include links to guides for that at the end of this PowerPoint. And then I just thought of some tips for best practices that if I was coming in to get started on grad school all over, these are the things I'd want to know. So one of the first things, especially in the humanities, that I think is important is to focus on the question you're trying to answer when you're setting up a research project. What are you asking? What is it that you're trying to discover? Because I myself know I have a tendency to start with, oh, I want to argue such and such. Well, it's great, I want to argue that, but what's the question I'm trying to answer? Because if I already have the argument, maybe there's more to be discovered than what I already know. And so the purpose of research papers is really to go out and learn something new, not simply argue something that we already know or think we know. Sometimes it could be a good starting point to say, I want to argue this, find a way to ask a question where that may be the answer. And then through the research, let it lead you to discover whether or not your argument in the first place was as accurate as maybe you thought. And then presenting an arguable thesis. So you're entering grad school, but I'm sure by this point you've heard of a thesis statement and probably spent a long time thinking about how to create a useful thesis statement, an effective thesis statement. And it is one of the greatest challenges, I think, of writing, because it feels like there's a lot of pressure on boiling it down to like, this is my argument. So a couple of just general tips on thesis statements. They don't always conform to just one sentence. Sometimes a thesis statement is a bit longer, and that's okay. But if you can consolidate to a simple one sentence, I argue that, it can help add clarity to your project. And I write here, avoid value judgments. So in the humanities, I think it can be easy to get distracted by the opinions or arguments that we come to projects with and want to say that something is good or bad, and find ways to prove that. But rather, it's better to ask questions about how things are the way they are, or what influences lead to certain results. Asking questions that are more about discovering how things are in the world and making meaning out of them rather than placing our opinions of whether they're good or bad. And then I've linked, and you'll have the PowerPoint afterwards, but the Axes model, which is a way to set up your evidence and to defend your thesis with your primary source evidence. And in the briefest terms, it's making an assertion or a claim, explaining it, showing an example, and then explaining it, and then offering the significance. And this can be a really great way if you haven't been writing for a while, or if you are getting nervous about starting your grad papers. Using this grid can be an excellent way to just prompt yourself with the questions that will help you to formulate the paragraphs that are really going to move you through your paper and your argument. I definitely recommend like reviewing this after the fact. Yes, we will be sending this all out to you as well. And then finally, oh, of course, no problem. And then finally, just tips for best practices. It's really important in the humanities to demonstrate engagement with a scholarly conversation. It's already been said today, but I reiterate it because if I've learned nothing else, professors will ask you, how are you engaging in the scholarly conversation? And I think especially in a realm like cultural studies, it can be hard sometimes to get started and figure out, well, how do I enter this conversation? You know, who is talking about this topic and how do I, you know, get involved in the discussion? But I think that when you start your research, you'll start to realize, okay, here's the pieces I'm drawing from, and those are the pieces of the conversation that you're entering. So it's about demonstrating your familiarity with the research and the scholarship that's been published on it to enter it. And last comment on that just being that, and if it's something that has not been done, there are certainly foundational pieces that have been written that led you to the place to be able to ask the question you're asking. So sometimes demonstrating your engagement with the scholarly conversation may not be as nuanced as your particular topic, but they could be stepping stones that gave you enough background to be able to then ask this question that needs to be explored. And those are my best tips. But I'm sure I could come up with more. If you ever want to chat after the webinar, feel free.
Nice. Yeah, one thing I really liked that you touched on was just the idea of linearity, where a lot of the time, as especially starting back at this, or if in the early stages of writing at this level, you might want to think that you're going to be able to start at the top and just produce something. But I don't think the research project in any field, or the research process, excuse me, in any field should actually look like that. I think in terms of process, as you mentioned, I mean, starting with what is, the literature review, more or less, right? And you have some ideas about what you want to argue, as you were talking about, but really thinking about developing that section first and taking notes and possibly even writing some of that to help lead you towards what exactly your research question is, what exactly your thesis statement is. And then again, so I'm from the humanities as well. And I found myself on many occasions having an experience of, in writing studies, what's called, I want to say generative writing, where you develop ideas through the process of writing. Mm-hmm. So sitting down and getting your brain in kind of the cognitive mode of putting words on a page or typing on a screen, and new ideas emerge from that activity, things that weren't planned beforehand. So you want to leave some of that open in terms of the process, right? So that upon reaching the conclusion, maybe what actually needs to go into your introduction, you actually just wrote it in your conclusion. So maybe you need to take some of that and think about how to rework it and then approach it in terms of how your audience is reading it. But maybe giving yourself a chance to have new ideas emerge through the actual process of writing, which isn't going to then be a linear process. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so.
I also always love a good strategy and a take-home task, something to think about that you can apply directly. And I think one thing that comes to mind, just in terms of many of you being first year here at CGU, is when you're starting your first year and you're selecting your topics for classes, maybe consider the possibility of this could be eventually my thesis, or this could be part of my dissertation. Doesn't mean you're tied to it, but thinking in that way can help you think broader about the questions you're asking, and then also help you narrow down that piece of the question. And it can also help you kind of like an exploratory activity to start with this, idea of maybe this will be my end project, to help eliminate ideas that maybe at first you thought would be exciting and that you'd want to be tied to for a long time, that are not ultimately what you select to do those larger projects on. But it's always good to think about, the eventual end goal of those projects as well, while you're doing these seminar papers, research papers along the way, as almost stepping stones to train you and prepare you for that larger project.
Nice, definitely. All right, so let's jump to science and social science research papers. Slightly different than the humanities here. As you'll see, the representation on the screen is meant to reflect what a journal article submission looks like. So it includes title, author, abstract, keywords, and references at the end. Oftentimes, if you are asked to write an entire research paper, if you're in the science or social sciences, you'll be asked to include the references, but not worry so much about abstract, keywords, those sorts of points. Nonetheless, we'll focus on the major sections here. I am RD. This paper is often called. I prefer I'm rad, intro, methods, results, and discussion. In in practice, this is meant to reflect the scientific method, right? So you ask a question, you discover something about the world that you want to explore, there's a problem, you crystallize the expression of that problem, you develop a method, a means to answer that question. You then go through that method, you test, you get results from that test, and then you analyze those results. Going back to your initial question, possibly, a hypothesis about what the answer will be, and you analyze the results in the context of that question only, maybe previous research on connected topics, and then how it advances knowledge or understanding in the field. So in most science and social science disciplines now, this structure is conventionalized, right? And a great resource here is, of course, the APA manual, which is a style guide as well as a citation or reference guide. So though most of us will first encounter APA or MLA and Chicago are the exact same way, encounter them as a citation system, which is part of what they include, all of them are actual style guides as well. So in APA, you're able to go and learn about how to format APA papers, also how to write these different sections, what exactly should go in these sections, even how the language should be structured, as well as how to cite sources and integrate them. So that's a great guide for the sciences and social sciences. But so how you can think of this, I like to think of these as rhetorical moves in some respects. So in the introduction, the idea is to persuade your reader that there is some unknown, right, on a topic, or there is a problem in the world, and that existing research has not adequately either developed our knowledge on that unknown or solved that problem. And consequently, your research will do that in some way, okay? So all of that is kind of squished into the introduction. And we have a really helpful model, it's called the CARS model, that kind of goes through those moves. But here is where you're going to, establish the importance of a topic, and then you're going to talk about what other research has been done on that topic in brief, then highlighting a gap or some other sort of niche within the literature on that topic that you're going to address in your research question, and then fill that niche or gap with your project, okay? The methods then describe how you do the research project in depth with enough precision that someone else can replicate your research, can do the exact same thing. So that's why I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like a subgenre. It's like, it's the most precise language, the driest portion of these papers, always a very succinct expression of what was done, both materially, so in terms of materials and in terms of method. Typically, to take a quick step back, pretty much every social science, and a lot of sciences as well, the more physical sciences, let's say, require a literature review to be squished in between these two. So though you will allude to previous literature in the introduction to briefly establish what's been done on your topic in the field in order to set up your gap, which sets up your own research, that's kind of the rhetorical use of it in the introduction. In the literature review, you need to establish what you talked about in the introduction. Yes, I was right about the significance of this, about what's been done before, about this little niche being missing, and that my question is really significant because it's missing, right? So all of that is done through a longer literature review, which goes over in much greater depth than you provide in the introduction, previous scholarship on the topic in the field. So jumping back, after methods, you have the results. So the results are where you're going to present what happened after you applied the methods in whatever way to the question at hand that you introduced in the introduction. And this will be a combination of facts and figures. You know, typically, you're using either like tables or charts of various sorts. Tables typically lean towards a more precise expression of data. Charts are going to be to highlight trends over time. So that charts are typically for longitudinal studies. And then accompanying that in the results section, after just a clear expression of the results, is what's often called like data commentary. So you want to highlight certain elements of that data for your readers so they don't have to do it themselves, of what like the key parts of your results, your findings are. From there, the discussion then returns back to your research question to analyze the results you just presented, to answer the so what question of your specific research, and then to see what its contribution is, both in terms of solving the problem, answering the research question, as well as in the field. And then some of that kind of spills into the conclusion as well, where the conclusion will often be used to, maybe highlight some limitations of your research that might be found at the end of the discussion section as well, but then really to point towards a broader application and ideally next steps. Given that we addressed the research question in this way, in the way of this paper, and got these results analyzed to show this other thing, what's next? What should we research next? Here are some suggestions. So that's the primary use of the conclusion. If you look for this, you'll see it. There are clear subheadings usually. Breaking this up in the journal articles you'll be asked to read within your discipline. And if you kind of keep in mind these sorts of rhetorical moves and the answering of these questions, while you start to read and can kind of see them, as I was talking about before, in terms of both content and what the writer is doing, I think it'll help you a lot when you're asked to design these yourself and then write about them. So 2 things I wanted to point out before we jump to questions, and they're both resources through the Center for Writing and Rhetoric that extend all of these ideas that we've been talking about. The first is our set of Canvas modules, which are available to all students. We looked at a section of one here with the axis model. This is what the page looks like. We've developed, and we're adding more modules all the time. We just started doing this. So let's say you do want to learn more about cohesion and coherence, about the axis model, about staying on topic within a paragraph or within a section. You'll see here that we've developed modules that take you through it in a number of different modalities. We've got, explanation, links to handouts and websites, texts to read to get a fuller picture. And I think also quite helpfully, we've recorded videos for the vast majority of these. Where are they? Here they are. So like one of our wonderful senior consultants, Katrina, did this great creating effective paragraphs with axes. So there's a lot more information on on a lot of the topics we talked about today. We're going to be adding one on thesis statements, for example, soon, when I'm presenting soon. So we've got a number of them here. We'll be adding a lot more, and these are really helpful. Do you want to see what a literature review looks like? Some suggestions for how to write one. We have them step by step in these modules. And then we also have online resources on our website, which have a lot of just great handouts. And we'll be integrating our YouTube channel here shortly. We just restructured, redesigned this a bit this summer. So there are a lot more resources here for different elements of these writing tasks and processes. Besides that, the center itself. Arline, do you mind maybe just briefly talking about these different things that we do, programs?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we offer writing consultations, which are a wonderful opportunity for you to bring your work in progress or your ideas to the center and work with a graduate writing consultant who can give you feedback or help you brainstorm. They're very interactive and collaborative meetings where you can either come in person in fall of 2021, or we do them online in a virtual format through our WC Online system. And then also we do offer email review appointments where you would submit your document and then your consultant will review it, add their commentary and feedback, and then send it back to you. So we offer a few different types of appointment options, and all of those are great for working with a consultant directly on your work. We have writing retreats, boot camps, all sorts of events, qualifying exam weekend, preparation weekend, and then other types of retreats that are writing focused events where you are working with a facilitator to move through scheduled blocks of writing, and there's breaks worked in. Online format, you would take a break and go about your way, but on campus, as we return to campus and have some of these events this semester, it will be exciting because there will be opportunities to engage with other students and talk to other students in between the working blocks and network, which is cool. We have writing groups. Writing groups take place in a couple different ways. If you and some of your colleagues get together and want to start a writing group but don't know how to get started, you can reach out to the Writing Center and we can meet with you for a first kind of introductory session and teach you how to run a writing group effectively, some of the best practices and strategies to use. And we also have write-in studios, which are more or less drop-in writing hours or working hours where a consultant facilitates and you have scheduled writing times and then breaks. So it's kind of a guided writing group session. And then finally, the online resources, which Marcus has already talked to us about.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say, a number of these events are open to, students in their first semester. So even though they might be titled Writing Retreat, or you might think a lot of them are geared towards post-coursework milestones, we have a number, especially the write-in studios. We'll have those, Arline is spearheading that effort. We'll have those, during the day, weekdays, also in the evenings. On the weekends, they're called writing retreats, but you can come in and do any type of work. If you just want to do reading in community to help keep you motivated, or to meet other students, that sort of thing, or, it's great. It's great. And I highly recommend checking out, you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. It's the easiest way to get the info, or just check our events calendar. But yeah.
And this goes back to those differences between undergraduate and graduate writing, which I think stands out in graduate writing. It's a very isolating experience. So if you find yourself stuck or feeling a bit isolated in your first semester or your first year, know that that's totally common, but joining some of these events and holding yourself accountable to show up to some of these events might help to kind of alleviate that experience.